What the trains left behind. Today, there are monuments scattered across small towns, plaques, statues, and even the occasional museum display. In Concordia, Kansas, there's the National Orphan Train Complex, part museum, part memorial, built to honor those 200,000 children who once rode west. Visitors can see suitcases, letters, and faded photos, little reminders of small hands holding on to something as the train pulled away. It's peaceful there. Quiet. The kind of place where you could almost fall asleep imagining the wheels turning, the whistle blowing, and the long, lonely promise of a better life somewhere down the line. The real ending. So that's where we end tonight. A country learning to care, one mistake at a time. A movement that started with hope, stumbled through decades of contradiction, and finally drifted to a stop. The orphan trains weren't villains. They weren't heroes. They were just the sound of a young nation trying to make sense of compassion, and occasionally getting it wrong in spectacularly bureaucratic ways. If you listen closely, maybe you can still hear them, the rhythm of old wheels on steel, the faint hum of prayers and paperwork, the echo of children learning to call somewhere new, home. And maybe that's enough story for one night. So, close your eyes, if they're not closed already. The train has reached the station. Rest easy, you've made it all the way west. It's estimated that only a fraction of those 200,000 children can be traced today. The rest are ghosts, names that flicker in census records, half-remembered in family stories, or misfiled under the wrong town. For genealogists, the orphan train riders are both a treasure and a nightmare. Family trees branch off into question marks. Last names end abruptly. Some descendants only discover the truth by accident, a stray document, a whispered memory, or a photograph of a child they can't quite identify. The survivors speak. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that historians began tracking down surviving riders. By then, they were elderly, in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, with long, quiet lives behind them. Some agreed to interviews. They told stories of fear, kindness, hard work, and resilience. Many had long since made peace with what happened. Others hadn't. One woman said, "I never forgave them for sending me away, but I thanked them for giving me a chance." Another said simply, "I don't know if I was lucky. I was alive." Maybe that's enough. It's not the kind of testimony that fits neatly into a feel-good ending. But it's real. The myth versus the memory. The modern retellings of the orphan train often swing between two extremes, the heartwarming and the horrifying. The truth, of course, is quieter than both. It was a system built on good intentions, limited options, and 19th-century logic. It helped some, harmed others, and left everyone slightly uneasy. It's the kind of story that reminds us how complicated doing good can be, especially when the people being helped don't have a say. And maybe that's what makes it worth remembering. The trains have become part of national folklore, a comforting story about progress and opportunity, stripped of all the discomfort. Enter the social workers. Meanwhile, a new breed of professionals had arrived to make the old reformers look quaint. The social worker, clipboard in hand, college degree freshly pressed, became the symbol of modern compassion. They replaced moral sermons with case files. Instead of saving souls, they started talking about child development. And they did something the orphan train program never quite managed, they followed up. They visited homes. They wrote reports. They actually checked if children were alive, fed, and literate. It was radical stuff. The 1920s, a slow fade to black. By 1920, only a few orphan trains were still running, mostly through Catholic charities. The world had changed. Automobiles were common, phones existed, and small towns weren't as isolated. The idea of shipping children across the country by rail now seemed quaintly Victorian, the kind of thing your grandparents might whisper about, embarrassed but nostalgic. And then came the Great Depression. By 1929, when the last official orphan train left New York, America was on the edge of collapse. Suddenly, everyone was poor. The social experiment of sending city children to rural families lost its meaning when rural families themselves couldn't feed the ones they already had. That final train was almost symbolic, a farewell to an era when faith and idealism outran practicality. The Lost Paper Trail. After the movement ended, the Children's Aid Society boxed up its records, hundreds of thousands of documents, often incomplete, scribbled, or faded. Many were lost in fires, floods, or bureaucratic indifference. Others simply disintegrated with time. A changing America. The other big problem for the orphan train model was that America itself was changing. By 1910, the frontier was gone. The wide-open farmlands of the Midwest were filling up. Fewer families needed extra hands, and the concept of free child labor was starting to make people uncomfortable, not enough to stop using it, of course, but uncomfortable enough to whisper about it. Cities, meanwhile, were modernizing. Social work became a profession. Local charity bureaus sprang up. And new laws slowly made it harder to move children across state lines without approval. The nation was learning bureaucracy, and, like every new bureaucrat, it was suddenly very interested in forms, signatures, and accountability. The children grow up. By this time, many of the earliest orphan train riders were adults, parents themselves, scattered across the country. Some became successful, even proud of their beginnings. They'd say things like, "I came west on the train, best thing that ever happened to me." Others never spoke of it at all. A few, when interviewed in the 1910s and 1920s, said they still dreamed of train whistles, that low, lonely sound echoing through their sleep. It was the sound of leaving. And for many, it never quite stopped. The orphan train on film, almost. By the 1920s, the orphan train movement was fading, but nostalgia was setting in. Newspapers published sentimental pieces about the brave little emigrants. Local fairs invited old riders to appear as honored guests. The Children's Aid Society, sensing a PR opportunity, leaned into the wholesome side of the story. It was America's favorite pastime, polishing tragedy until it gleamed. One early silent film, The Orphan's Reward, 1913, romanticized the whole process: plucky child, kind farmer, happy ending. Never mind the reality. These were the progressives, social workers, journalists, and early psychologists who loved clipboards and hated moral ambiguity. They began publishing reports showing that many placed-out children were really just unpaid farmhands. That oversight was basically non-existent. That some children had died or gone missing. Suddenly, what had once been hailed as a heroic movement began to sound like an embarrassing secret. Meet the new reformers. One of the loudest critics was Jane Addams, founder of Chicago's Hull House, the closest thing America had to a conscience at the time. She and her fellow reformers believed that poverty wasn't a moral failing but a social problem, something caused by inequality, not by bad character. Which, in 1905, was practically revolutionary. They argued that instead of exporting poor children to the countryside, maybe we should fix the cities themselves. Build schools. Offer healthcare. Support families before they collapse. Charles Loring Brace's old philosophy, that city life itself was corrupting, started to sound quaint. The government gets involved, finally. In 1909, something remarkable happened: the White House Conference on the Care of Dependent Children, the first national meeting on child welfare in U.S. history. President Theodore Roosevelt, yes, the one who wrestled bears and gave speeches about manliness, invited reformers and clergy to discuss what to do with America's orphans. The result? A major shift in thinking. For the first time, the government declared that children should, whenever possible, be raised in families, not institutions or placements. It was an enormous moral pivot. The idea of sending kids away to strangers now seemed a bit barbaric. The orphan trains didn't stop immediately, but from that point on, they were living on borrowed time. There's something haunting about the orphan trains, even without any actual hauntings. No blood, no monsters, just the quiet echo of thousands of small footsteps fading into the prairie. They were children who didn't fit into the growing puzzle of industrial America, so the nation sent them somewhere they would. Or thought it did. And maybe that's why this story feels so modern. Because every generation, in one way or another, finds a new group of people to send away in the name of helping them. Let's stay on the tracks a little longer, because next, we're going to drift through the final decades of the movement. The rise of new reformers, the shifting idea of family, and the slow realization that good intentions can still derail an entire childhood, the long goodbye of the orphan trains. Hey again. Still with me? Good. Because we're nearing the quieter stretch of the story, the years when the trains started to slow, and the country began to outgrow the idea that you could fix social problems with a timetable and a prayer. Let's settle back in. Imagine the world at the turn of the century, 1900. The rails are old now, worn smooth by decades of wheels and weather. Steam still curls into the air. But things are changing. Factories are rising, cities expanding, and the United States, that restless, awkward teenager of nations, is starting to talk about modernity. And in that new modern world, the old orphan trains are beginning to look, well, a little outdated. The progressive era, when reformers got busy. Around 1900, America was having one of its moral mood swings. Everything was a cause: labor rights, women's suffrage, public sanitation, prohibition, and, naturally, child welfare. Middle-class reformers, mostly women with a lot of energy and a lot of opinions, started asking questions about what actually happened to the children being placed out on the trains. These rides were a little more supervised. Nuns often traveled with the children, keeping records and correspondence. But the process was still fraught. Sometimes the local Protestant population wasn't thrilled about groups of Irish Catholic kids showing up uninvited. In one infamous 1904 incident in Arizona, Catholic orphans sent to live with Mexican families were literally kidnapped by an armed mob of white townspeople who decided those families weren't fit. The courts sided with the mob. Because, of course they did. So yes, the orphan train story is also a story about race, religion, and who America thought counted as good people. Growing up on the prairie. For many children, their new homes were less about affection and more about functionality. Farm work was brutal, dawn to dusk, with winters that could freeze fingers and summers that baked the fields dry. Some kids adapted. They learned to ride horses, mend fences, milk cows. They found small joys, a kind word, a shared meal, a rare hug. Others grew up numb, carrying that orphan mentality into adulthood, always polite, always grateful, always ready to move again if someone told them to. Psychologists today might call it attachment trauma. Back then, they just called it good manners. The unintended legacy. The orphan train program did leave one lasting impact: it set the stage for the modern foster care system. By the early 1900s, reformers realized that sending kids across the country without oversight might not be the best idea. So they began developing local placement programs, with background checks, social workers, and court supervision, baby steps toward what we now call child welfare. The Children's Aid Society evolved, too. It still exists today, now focused on education and poverty relief. They even have a small museum dedicated to the orphan train riders, a quiet nod to a complicated past. A ghost story without ghosts. One woman, Emma Burton, remembered standing on a church stage in 1888 while families in the audience whispered about her freckles. She was chosen by an older couple who needed help cooking. She said they were kind, mostly. But she never forgot the feeling of being looked over like a horse at auction. Another man, Frank DeFord, recalled being rejected 3 times before someone picked him. "I was small," he said, "and they wanted strong boys." That sense of rejection, of being measured and found wanting, stuck with many of them for life. Even when they grew up and did well, they often avoided talking about their childhoods. They'd tell people they were adopted, but skip the part about the train and the stage. Because nothing ruins small talk like explaining that your adoption process involved an audience and a whistle stop. Paperwork and ghosts. If you try to trace one of these children through historical records, good luck. Names changed constantly. Birth certificates were rare. Many families didn't bother with formal adoptions, they simply kept the children and called it a day. Some orphans were renamed after the towns they arrived in. A boy named Thomas O'Brien became Tom Kansas. Another, Anna Kowalski, turned into Annie Ford, named after the train itself. There are even cases where multiple children ended up with the same name because the records got mixed up. The society's clerks, overwhelmed by paper, sometimes wrote things like, small Irish boy, freckles, mild disposition, and called it sufficient. Which means there are entire genealogies today built on bureaucratic guesswork. The Catholic rivalry. By the 1870s, the Catholic Church had decided it was done letting Protestants monopolize the orphan trade. Catholic charities, especially the New York Foundling Hospital, began organizing their own trains, sending Catholic children to Catholic families in the Midwest. A boy named Edward Ryan was taken in by a farmer in Iowa who treated him like a son. He got to go to school, learned carpentry, and even inherited part of the family land. He used to tell people he'd been adopted by America itself. Which is a nice line, though, given that his first few years had been spent in a New York alley, you can understand the enthusiasm. Still, for every Edward Ryan, there were 10 children who didn't make it that far. The oversight problem. Let's pause for a moment and talk about oversight, or the charming lack thereof. The Children's Aid Society promised to send agents to check up on the children, to make sure they were being treated well. These agents, however, were few in number and responsible for tracking thousands of placements spread across hundreds of miles. The answer, apparently, was, all of the above. The Great Divide, city versus country. Part of the orphan train idea came from a deep distrust of cities. Urban poverty was seen as contagious, not just economically, but morally. Reformers believed children raised among vice would inevitably become criminals, drunkards, or worse, Democrats. The countryside, by contrast, was painted as pure. Rural people were supposed to be wholesome, self-reliant, Protestant, and, most importantly, white. So, in a way, the trains weren't just redistributing children. They were redistributing morality, taking the children of immigrants, Catholics, and the urban poor, and cleansing them through exposure to farm life. A social detox by plow and prayer. The children's voices. Most of what we know about the orphan train riders comes from later interviews, letters, and rare memoirs. He plowed fields, hauled water, and slept in the barn when space was tight. And yet, when interviewed as an adult decades later, he called them good people. That's the thing about memory, it smooths out the rough edges when survival depends on gratitude. The Irish girl and the Protestant farm. Then there was Mary O'Leary, age 12. Irish, Catholic, red hair, and, as the records note, too talkative. She was sent to Kansas in 1873, where she was placed with a Protestant farming family who didn't appreciate her cheerful devotion to the Virgin Mary. They confiscated her rosary, made her attend their church, and insisted she stop calling priests father. For a while, Mary refused to eat. Eventually, she adjusted, sort of. By adulthood, she'd changed her name to Marie Lane, married a shopkeeper, and told her children she'd been born in St. Louis. Because sometimes, pretending you belonged somewhere was easier than explaining how you got there. The lucky ones. Not everyone's story ended in tragedy or quiet assimilation. Some did find a sense of home. A boy named Edward Ryan was taken in by a farmer in Iowa who treated him like a son. He got to go to school, learned carpentry, and even inherited part of the family land. He used to tell people he'd been adopted by America itself. Which is a nice line, though, given that his first few years had been spent in a New York alley, you can understand the enthusiasm. Still, for every Edward Ryan, there were 10 children who didn't make it that far. The oversight problem. Let's pause for a moment and talk about oversight, or the charming lack thereof. The Children's Aid Society promised to send agents to check up on the children, to make sure they were being treated well. These agents, however, were few in number and responsible for tracking thousands of placements spread across hundreds of miles. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians began piecing together the records. Reunions were held. Survivors shared stories, both heartbreaking and hopeful. Some remembered finding kindness. Others remembered only the sound of the train. And together, they left behind a strange, bittersweet legacy, of a nation trying to solve poverty with tickets and timetables. Let's drift a little deeper, because this story isn't just about trains. It's about the people behind them, the reformers, the children, the towns, and the uneasy idea of what it meant to save someone in the 19th century. So, let's float westward, toward the farmlands, and meet a few of the forgotten passengers themselves, the children who rode the rails. Hey again. Still awake? Or halfway gone already? That's fine either way. Because tonight, we're not in a rush. We're somewhere between 1860 and 1900, sitting in a creaky railcar full of wool coats and nervous silence. The children stare out the windows as the city disappears behind them, the slums, the noise, the tenements, the only world they've ever known. Ahead lies the promise of something better. Or at least, something different. Let's meet a few of them. The boy with too many names. The records call him John Green, though that wasn't really his name. It rarely was for these kids. Most had names changed somewhere between New York and Nebraska, to sound more American, more Protestant, more normal. John was about 9 when he boarded an orphan train in 1867. His parents had died of typhoid, which was practically a family tradition in New York that year. The city was full of it, and by it, I mean both typhoid and orphans. John was sent west, ending up with a farming couple in Illinois who, according to reports, were stern but fair. Which, if you've ever read a 19th century social report, usually means, worked him like a mule but didn't actively hit him in public. It was the 19th century version of, look at this one good outcome and ignore the rest. Meanwhile, back in New York. The city, of course, kept producing more street children. Every new wave of immigrants brought more poverty. Disease and overcrowding made sure there was always a fresh supply of orphans. So the trains kept running. Sometimes several per week. Children gathered at the docks, clutching tiny parcels, waiting for their ticket west. And the system grew into a full-fledged network. The Children's Aid Society was joined by other groups, like the New York Foundling Hospital and various religious orders, all running their own trains. It became a national institution. A conveyor belt of childhoods. A country growing up, sort of. By the early 1900s, though, attitudes were beginning to shift. Progressive reformers started asking uncomfortable questions, like whether children might need more than just food and a Bible. Newspapers began publishing exposés about mistreatment. Psychologists started talking about emotional development, a wild concept at the time. And the federal government, for the first time, started to get involved in child welfare. By the 1920s, the orphan train program was running out of steam. The rise of foster care, child labor laws, and new urban welfare systems made it look increasingly outdated. The last official train rolled out in 1929, the same year the Great Depression hit, when, ironically, a whole new generation of families would struggle to feed their children again. The quiet legacy. After 75 years, the orphan trains faded into memory. Most Americans forgot about them. The children themselves, now adults, rarely spoke of it. Many didn't even know their real names or where they'd come from. Some children spent years on the move like this. Others vanished from records entirely. There was no safety net, no return address, no guarantee. Just the sound of the train and the slow realization that you were, for better or worse, on your own. America's PR problem. Public opinion on the orphan trains was complicated. To city elites, the program was a triumph, a model of Christian charity and innovation. To Western farmers, it was cheap labor wrapped in moral sugar. And to critics, especially Catholic leaders, it was blatant cultural kidnapping. Catholic charities eventually started their own orphan trains to make sure their children were placed with Catholic families, which added a whole new layer of denominational competition. Because apparently, even saving children had to be a Protestant-Catholic rivalry. The early horror stories. Newspapers occasionally caught wind of what happened to some of the children. A few were found starving or abused. Some were re-enslaved, yes, after slavery was abolished, under apprenticeship contracts. A handful even died en route. In 1859, one report described a boy found wandering barefoot after being beaten by his host family. The Children's Aid Society responded by tightening its placement rules, slightly. But the truth was, once those trains left the station, the children were out of sight and out of mind. The myth of the self-made child. Brace loved to publish success stories. He'd write glowing newsletters about boys who grew up to become mayors or businessmen, girls who became good Christian mothers. And sure, some did. But the vast majority simply disappeared into the census, absorbed into the American working class, anonymous and untraceable. There was no real follow-up, no detailed statistics, no accountability. And if a child ran away or was mistreated, the system rarely followed up. Paperwork was spotty. Supervision was inconsistent. And in a time before telephones or standardized welfare laws, there was only so much a few overworked city reformers could do. By the 1870s, over 20,000 children had been shipped out. By the time the program ended in 1929, that number had ballooned to more than 200,000. 200,000 little lives packed into train cars and sent into the unknown. The selling point, moral makeovers. Brace and his peers genuinely believed they were doing good work. They described the movement in almost religious terms, saving souls, redeeming the fallen, Americanizing immigrant children. Because yes, there was also a convenient dose of xenophobia mixed in. Many of these street kids were Irish or Italian, the children of recent immigrants. Protestants like Brace saw them as heathens, too Catholic, too foreign, too poor to ever blend in. Sending them west wasn't just about fresh air. It was about purity. Moral, racial, and religious. And the towns that accepted them often agreed. The children were expected to attend Protestant services, regardless of their original faith. Many lost their birth names, their languages, and their sense of identity along the way. A train ride of no return. Imagine being 6 years old. You're handed a small suitcase, maybe a Bible, maybe a crust of bread. You get on a train with a group of other children you barely know. The adults tell you you're going somewhere better. The ride takes days. Sometimes weeks. You stop in towns you've never heard of. You watch your companions get taken away one by one. Until it's your turn to stand on a stage and hope someone points to you. If no one does, you get back on the train and move to the next town. And so the orphan train movement was born. Starting in 1854, trainloads of children, some as young as 3 years old, began leaving New York City, heading west to towns in Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, and beyond. Each train carried anywhere from 10 to 100 kids, chaperoned by a few nervous adults from the Aid Society who were supposed to make sure things went smoothly. Spoiler, they rarely did. The selection process, child auctions in church. When the trains arrived in small towns, there wasn't exactly an adoption agency waiting. Instead, the Children's Aid Society would set up meetings in churches, schools, or courthouses. Locals would gather, usually curious farmers and their wives, and the children were lined up on stage, scrubbed clean and dressed in donated clothes that didn't always fit. Then the community was invited to select which ones they wanted. It wasn't called an auction, but it might as well have been. Farmers checked the kids' teeth, tested their grip strength, even asked them to lift sacks of grain. Younger, healthier-looking boys went first, good labor potential. Girls were often chosen to be housekeepers, nannies, or, in some tragic cases, something worse. The official policy was that these weren't servants, they were apprentices or wards. They were supposed to receive food, shelter, education, and moral upbringing. But in reality, oversight was minimal. Once a child got placed with a family, the aid society often just moved on to the next town. The mixed bag of happy endings. Now, to be fair, not every story ended badly. Some children really did find families who loved them. They grew up, got educated, inherited farms, and even spoke fondly of their new lives. But for others, it was bleak. Many became unpaid laborers. Some were beaten or neglected. Some were moved again and again when families got bored of them, a kind of 19th-century foster care game of hot potato. And the city didn't love them back. The philanthropist with a plan. Enter Charles Loring Brace, a man who looked like he'd scold you for breathing too loudly in church. Brace was a Protestant minister and a social reformer, which, in the 1850s, basically meant he had a beard, a cause, and a belief that he could fix poor people by telling them to behave better. He was part of the early wave of people who thought poverty was a moral disease, and that with enough fresh air, farm work, and exposure to Protestant values, you could cure it. So in 1853, he founded something called the Children's Aid Society in New York. The goal? Save the city's street children. The method? Ship them out of the city. Because nothing says rescue like sending a bunch of unaccompanied minors halfway across the country to live with strangers you've never met. The big idea, send them west. Brace's plan was pretty simple: rural America needed labor, cities had too many children. Solution: combine the two problems and call it charity. He imagined it like a win-win. Farmers in the Midwest would get much needed help, free, of course, and the children would grow up breathing clean country air instead of factory soot. They'd learn good values, attend Sunday school, and maybe even get a little love along the way. It was all very optimistic. The forgotten orphan trains, a nation's sleepy secret. Hey guys. Tonight, we're going to drift back to a different kind of America, one that was busy pretending to be wholesome while quietly shipping its unwanted children across the country. So, fluff your pillow, dim your screen, and settle in. Because tonight, we're boarding a train. A train full of children. Not the Hogwarts kind. The 19th century, overcrowded, underfed kind. This is the story of the Orphan trains, a 75-year social experiment that sounds heartwarming on paper, and just mildly horrifying in practice. The setting, America's Gilded Grit. So, let's start with the basics. It's the mid-1800s. Cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia are booming, if by booming you mean covered in soot and full of people coughing into their soup. Industrialization is hitting its awkward teenage years. Immigrants are pouring in by the shipload, desperate for work, and the cities don't know what to do with them. The streets are loud, the air is bad, and somewhere in between the piles of horse manure and factory smoke, are children. Thousands of them. By 1850, it's estimated that over 30,000 homeless children lived on the streets of New York City alone. Some were true orphans, parents dead from disease or disaster, but most were what people politely called half-orphans. Meaning, mom or dad was still alive but too poor, too drunk, or too absent to actually raise them. They slept in alleys. Stole apples. Sold newspapers. Sometimes sold worse. They were nicknamed street Arabs, which was the charmingly racist 19th century way of saying feral.